3 letters. That's what Margaret Hollis received from the War Department between 1943 and 1946. The first said her daughter Ruth was missing in action near Anzio. The second, sent 9 months later, said Ruth had been recovered by advancing Allied forces and was receiving medical care in a hospital in France. The third, dated April 1946, said Ruth would not be returning home to Cleveland after all. She had died of complications from her captivity. Margaret was never told what those complications were. She was never told which hospital. She was never told where Ruth was buried. She was told, in a follow-up letter from a colonel she never met, that certain details of her daughter's service were classified in the interest of national security, and that she should take comfort in knowing Ruth had served her country with distinction. Margaret kept the 3 letters in a cedar box on top of her dresser for the next 41 years. She showed them to her grandchildren once, when the youngest asked what happened to Aunt Ruth. She said Ruth had been a soldier. She said Ruth had been very brave. She said she did not know what had happened to her, and she wished, more than anything else in her life, that she did. Margaret died in 1987. She never learned the truth. The truth was sitting in a file cabinet in a records depot in Suitland, Maryland, marked Top Secret, Restricted Handling. It would remain there unread for another 14 years. This is the story of what was in those files. It is the story of what happened to Allied servicewomen who fell into German hands between 1943 and the end of the war in Europe. It is not a comfortable story. It has been, for most of the last 80 years, a story the American, British, and French governments preferred you did not know. It is being told now because the last of the women who could tell it themselves are almost gone, and because Margaret Hollis, and roughly 200 mothers like her, deserved better than 3 letters and a locked file cabinet. To understand what happened, you have to understand what was new about the Second World War. It was the first modern conflict in which women wore military uniforms in significant numbers on the Allied side. The Women's Army Corps, or WAC, was authorized by Congress in May 1942. By 1945, roughly 150 American women had served in it. The British Auxiliary Territorial Service and the Air Transport Auxiliary put tens of thousands more women in uniform. French women served in the Resistance, which was not a uniformed force, but which the Geneva Conventions had recently expanded to cover under certain conditions. These women were, on paper, protected. The 1929 Geneva Convention on Prisoners of War made no distinction based on sex. A soldier was a soldier. A prisoner was a prisoner. Rank, unit, serial number. That was the deal. The deal did not hold. If stories like this, the ones that got left out of the textbooks, are something you want more of, I publish a new one every week. Subscribe if it sounds worth your time. Germany was not a signatory to the 1929 Convention's provisions in the way the Western Allies were, and even where it had signed, it interpreted the rules through the lens of Nazi ideology. Nazi doctrine held that women belonged in specific social roles: mother, wife, keeper of the home. A woman in a military uniform was, in the Nazi worldview, not a soldier who happened to be female. She was a woman who had abandoned her nature. That distinction, small as it sounds, was the pinhole through which a great deal of cruelty poured. Beginning in 1943, as Allied forces pushed into Sicily and then mainland Italy, German units began encountering captured women in Allied uniforms for the first time in meaningful numbers. What happened to those women was, in the beginning, ad hoc. Local commanders made local decisions. Some captured women were treated correctly and sent to standard prisoner camps. Others were not. By the middle of 1943, the ad hoc had become policy. A document recovered from the SS archives after the war, dated June 1943, and initialed by an officer in the Reich Security Main Office, established what German administrators called specialized handling for captured female military personnel from Western Allied nations. The document ran to 4 pages. It instructed that such prisoners were not to be processed through standard Wehrmacht prisoner of war channels. They were not to be reported to the International Committee of the Red Cross. They were to be transferred, within 72 hours of capture, to designated facilities under SS jurisdiction. The document did not explain, in plain language, what was to happen at those facilities. It did not need to. Here is what we know, from records that emerged in 3 waves. First, from captured German archives in 1945 to 1948. Then from the reunification of Germany in 1990, and then from the American and British declassifications that began in 2001 and 2010. There were, by the best current count, at least 15 such facilities operating across German-occupied Europe between mid-1943 and the spring of 1945. Some were in converted hospitals, some were in former convents, some were in nondescript buildings in the outskirts of cities like Frankfurt, Munich, and Paris. They were not marked, they were not inspected. The Red Cross did not know they existed. Between 400 and 600 Allied servicewomen passed through these facilities during the war. The exact number is not known because the records were, in many cases, deliberately destroyed as Allied forces approached in 1945. What we have is a set of fragments, transfer orders, interrogation summaries, medical reports written in the clinical German of the period, and the testimony of the women themselves, given in the years and decades that followed. The women were interrogated. That much is unsurprising. Male prisoners were interrogated too. What was different was the method. German intelligence had developed a set of procedures specifically for female prisoners, based on a theory, and this is documented in a training manual recovered from a facility outside Frankfurt in 1945, that Western women, raised in what the manual called bourgeois sexual morality, could be broken more efficiently through methods that attacked their sense of themselves as women. I am not going to detail those methods. The records exist. Historians have described them. The women themselves, when they could bring themselves to speak, described them. I will simply say this: what was done was systematic. It was documented. It was authorized at senior levels of the SS, and it constituted war crimes under the standards applied at Nuremberg. Standards that, in this specific category of crime, were never applied. That last point matters, so I want to sit on it for a moment. At Nuremberg, in 1945 and 1946, the International Military Tribunal prosecuted a wide range of German war crimes: crimes against prisoners of war, crimes against civilians, crimes against Jews and other targeted populations. What happened to Allied servicewomen in the specialized facilities was, in the documents, referred to obliquely or not at all. There were no dedicated prosecutions for it. The facilities themselves, where they were mentioned, were described in general terms and fold into broader categories. Why? The honest answer is that we do not fully know. But the partial answer, based on internal memoranda from both American and British intelligence services that have been declassified since 2001, is that Allied governments made a deliberate decision, several deliberate decisions, at several levels, to not make what happened public. Consider a memorandum from the U.S. Army's Office of the Assistant Chief of Staff for Intelligence, dated August 14, 1945. It was declassified in 2003. The relevant passage reads, "Full public disclosure of the treatment accorded female military personnel by enemy forces would serve no operational purpose and would likely produce significant negative effects on both public morale and the recruitment of women into future service. It is recommended that such information be retained under restricted classification." Consider a British Foreign Office minute from March 1947, declassified in 2010. References to the specialized treatment of female personnel by German authorities should be removed from all publications intended for general readership. The department is not persuaded that public interest is served by dwelling on aspects of enemy conduct which cannot now be remedied and which may prove prejudicial to the reconstruction of Anglo-German relations. Reconstruction of Anglo-German relations. That is the phrase. By 1947, the Cold War was starting. West Germany was becoming an ally. The Soviet Union was becoming the enemy, and the crimes committed against a few hundred women who were by then being told to go home and get on with their lives. Those crimes became, in the calculus of foreign policy, an inconvenience. The women were told to sign non-disclosure agreements. Many did. They were told that speaking about their experiences would be a violation of the Official Secrets Act in Britain or of comparable statutes in the United States. They were told, in some cases directly and in others by implication, that the country needed them to be quiet. Most of them were quiet. For 50 years they were quiet. Ruth Hollis was 23 years old when she was captured. She was a corporal in the 6820th Headquarters Company of the Women's Army Corps, attached to the 5th Army in Italy. She had been in the WWII for 18 months. She had trained as a cryptographic clerk. She was, by every account of her surviving colleagues, a serious young woman who took her work seriously and who had, before the war, been planning to become a schoolteacher. She was captured in late January 1944 during a German counterattack near the Anzio beachhead. She was one of 6 WWII personnel taken that week. Of those 6, 2 were returned through prisoner exchange in July 1944. 2 more were recovered by advancing Allied forces in late 1944. Ruth was recovered in April 1945 from a facility outside Munich. She was, by that point, unable to walk without assistance. She weighed 91 pounds. She had been in German custody for 14 months. She was hospitalized in France for 6 months. She wrote 3 letters to her mother during that period. Only one of them survives, and it is a strange, flat letter, the letter of someone who has been told what she can and cannot say. It talks about the weather. It talks about a nurse who reminded her of a friend from home. It does not mention Germany. It does not mention captivity. It ends with the sentence, "I do not think I will be quite the same person when I come home, and I hope you can love me anyway." Ruth died in that French hospital in March 1946. The official cause of death was listed as pneumonia, complicated by malnutrition. Her mother was not told about the other complications. Ruth's file was declassified in 2004. It runs to 87 pages. 62 of them are still redacted. The women who survived and came home, unlike Ruth, faced a different kind of erasure. They were given medical care that was, by the standards of the time, badly matched to what they needed. Post-traumatic stress was not understood the way it is now. What we would today call trauma-informed care did not exist. The women were seen by male doctors who had never dealt with anything like what they were describing, and many of those doctors, according to case files declassified in 2001, either refused to record what the women told them or recorded it under diagnostic categories like nervous exhaustion or, in one particularly bleak file, hysteria of the veteran type. Their marriages, when they married, often struggled. Their children, when they had them, often grew up sensing that something was wrong without ever being told what. The women themselves, when they tried to talk, were often not believed. Elise Devereux, a French resistance courier who had been captured in Lyon in September 1943 and held at a facility outside Paris until the following spring, tried in 1962 to tell her story to a French journalist. The journalist wrote a piece. The piece was not published. The editor of the magazine wrote to her afterward and said, in a letter she kept for the rest of her life, that her account was too dark for the readership and that he did not, personally, believe that events of the kind she described could have occurred on the scale she claimed. Elise wrote back. She said, "Monsieur, you do not have to believe me. The records exist. Someday someone will read them. I hope I am still alive when they do." She was not. Elise died in 1994. The relevant French records were declassified in 2007. The turning point, such as it was, came in the mid-1990s. A German historian named Klaus Bergmann was working through recently opened East German archives, material that had been held by the Stasi and that included German records seized by the Soviets at the end of the war. He found, in a folder that had been misfiled for decades under a general heading about medical experimentation, a set of documents that referred to the specialized facilities for Western Allied women. He published a paper about them in 1996 in a German historical journal. The paper was initially ignored. Then, in 1998, an American researcher named Helen Ramirez, working on a doctoral dissertation about the Women's Army Corps, came across Bergman's paper. She began cross-referencing his German documents with American records, some available, some still classified. She filed Freedom of Information Act requests. Some were denied, some were partially granted. The pattern that emerged over the next 3 years was the pattern this video is trying to describe. Ramirez's book came out in 2004. It is called The Sealed War. It is still the fullest account we have. It is out of print. It never sold many copies. I want to end where I started, with Margaret Hollis and her 3 letters. Margaret's granddaughter, a woman named Karen, who lives now in a suburb of Chicago, contacted the National Archives in 2005 after reading a newspaper piece about the declassifications. She requested her Aunt Ruth's file. It took 11 months. When the file came, she read the 87 pages, 62 of them redacted, twice. Then she called her mother, who was Ruth's younger sister, and who was, at that point, 79 years old and living in a nursing home in Ohio. Karen read parts of the file to her mother over the telephone. Her mother listened without speaking. When Karen was finished, her mother said only, "So that's what she was trying to write in that letter." That's what she couldn't say. They talked for a while longer. Karen's mother died. 6 months later, Karen kept her grandmother Margaret's cedar box, the one with the 3 letters. She added a 4th item to it. She added a printed copy of the 87-page file, redactions and all. She keeps the box in her hall closet. She has told her own daughter about it. She has told her daughter that when she dies, the box goes to the Library of Congress, along with a written explanation. The Library of Congress, as of last year, has begun a formal oral history and materials collection specifically for the families of Allied servicewomen who died in or as a result of German captivity. It is small, it is quiet, it does not get press coverage, but it exists. These stories deserve to be remembered. I will keep finding them and telling them straight. If you'll keep listening, somewhere in a hall closet in Illinois, there is a cedar box with 4 letters in it. Somewhere in a records depot in Maryland, there are files that were sealed for 6 decades and are now, page by redacted page, being opened. Somewhere in a small cemetery outside a French town, there is a stone with the name Ruth Hollis on it, and the dates 1920 to 1946, and nothing else. That is not enough. But it is more than there was, and it is more than there was ever meant to be. And every person who reads a name and holds it in their mind for a moment is a small correction to a very old silence, for Ruth, for Sarah, for Elise, for the ones whose names we still don't know.